So let me introduce Mira Rosenthal, who will be our first virtual guest today and who kindly agreed to talk to me about her translations of Tomasz Różycki's poetry. Besides being a translator, Mira holds a PhD in comparative literature from Indiana University, and she's also an acclaimed poet in her own right. In 2011, she published her first poetry book titled The Local World. So Mira has translated two collections of Tomasz Różycki's poetry so far, both of which were published by Zephyr Press. And in 2007, she translated The Forgotten Keys, which contains a selection of his poems from 5 different collections. Then 2 years ago, in 2013, she published Colonies, the translation that was generously awarded with a range of poetry and translation prizes. And perhaps most importantly for our audience in Oxford, it was also shortlisted for the Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize last year. So it is a really great pleasure to host Mira at our poetry evening with Tomasz Różycki in Oxford, even if it has to be in this digital form. So Mira, I would like to ask you a very general question first. Why Tomasz Różycki? Did you want to translate his poetry because you felt that there was something familiar in it and something you can identify yourself with, for example, in relation to your own writing, or were you rather intrigued by its exotic or strange element?
Well, it's really wonderful to join you, even if it is virtually. And thank you, Antonia, for reading the English versions. And I'm really glad that your audience will have a chance to hear Tomasz speak. He always speaks so eloquently about his own work. But in terms of how I came to choose to translate Tomasz's work, there were various threads that fed into my decision. Many of them, or some of them, were illogical or done by feel rather than explicit choice. And I say that because I think for me, certainly translating Tomasz's work has a lot to do with affinity or feeling that I can understand his sensibility as a poet. I would say that he has a very different sensibility than my own, but he's really great company. And I think for me as a translator, I want to, I pick up those poets who I want to be in the company of. And how I became aware of his work was somewhat serendipitously. I was living in Krakow on a Fulbright fellowship, which I had been given to work on my own book of poems, but I also really wanted to find out what was going on in contemporary contemporary Polish poetry, those poets who we didn't have in translation in the US, what some of the younger generation was doing. At the same time, my Polish was slowly being born. I went to Poland knowing very little Polish. So when I was living in Krakow, it was the same year that Tomasz won the Kościelski Prize for 12 Stations. And I went to that awards ceremony. So that was the first time that I really became aware of his work. And then I went out and sought out his lyrical poems and found that I was incredibly intrigued by his voice that combined both the historical awareness that I had come to know through some of the previous generation of Polish poets who are well known in English. So Czesław Miłosz's generation, Adam Zagajewski's generation, of course, Szymborska. So he had kind of an affinity that I recognized, but at the same time, a different, slightly more skeptical take on what it meant for a poet to engage with those big themes. So those were some of the things that brought me to his work. And then I had the good fortune of meeting him when I was living in Krakow that year. I got in touch with him through Adam Zagajewski and then went and visited him and his wife in Opole. So I got to see the surroundings that are so present in 12 Stations and in his sonnets and other lyrical poems. So all of those things for me, it was a confluence of events that really led me to his work. I wouldn't say that it's about an exoticism for me. but rather about why poets read in other traditions. And in large part, I think that's to gain a different perspective from one's own native realm, but also to have the feel of poets doing things that we don't allow our poets to do in America. And I both love that and get really frustrated at that in translating Tomasz's work. What I mean is that sometimes he'll do things that I know in a creative writing workshop here in the States, everyone would object to. You can't do that in a poem. That's too vague. That's too abstract. And sometimes I get frustrated with that. Come on, Tomasz, I want you to be more concrete. Mm-hmm. Give me an image here rather than this vague concept. But then at other times, it's exactly why I read his work, why I read other poets in translation, because we allow poets in translation to do things, and we exalt or find value in their work precisely because they do things that we don't do in American poetry right now.
Mm-hmm, I see. So you already mentioned that you were on a Fulbright scholarship when you were in Poland, in Krakow, and you got a chance to visit Opole as well, the hometown that Colonies in a nicely way described and depict. And besides this very universal aspect that you already described, do you find that the stay in Poland was significant to the way you yourself translated Colonies, the view of Opole and the chance to talk to Tomasz about your translation perhaps as well? Did it in a sense influence the way you translated and approached Colonies?
I think it influenced my understanding and feel for the cultural information in the poems, and my understanding of the unique history that Tomasz is so invested in his own family's migration from Lviv to the western territories of Poland. All of that definitely helped in kind of getting a sense of it, both bodily, because poetry comes from the body ultimately, and having that kind of understanding that's not only logical and historical. But in terms of the way that it influenced the, say, stylistics of the poems or the voice in the poems, that I think is in large part about inhabiting what the poems are in English, which is really lifting them out of Opole, out of Poland, and trying to establish some sort of ground for them to stand on in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So it influenced certain aspects, but not other aspects.
But could you shed more light on the process of translation? So did you consult Tomasz on any of the solutions, or did you just decide to rely on your own creative approach to the poem?
Oh, definitely. I talked with Tomasz. We actually are working on his new book of poems, the Book of Rotations, right now. And we work poem by poem. So I'll finish a translation and I'll send it off to him with various questions, or needing his okay for certain things that I've done. And then he'll send me back his comments. When we first started working, I think Tomasz's ability to read the English versions was pretty minimal, but I'm very impressed with how he's been learning English. And so he has a little bit more facility in reading the English versions now and weighing in on them. For Colonies in particular, I decided on a couple of things at the outset. One was that I wanted the poems to really be engaged with form. So I chose to really circle around iambic pentameter. And I say circle around because as the poems, the sonnets do in the Polish, the form kind of strays in the English to some degree. But first and foremost, it was about that form and the sonic texture of the translations. So that meant that I was in fact putting fidelity to meaning a little bit lower. But of course, it really helped me as a translator feeling comfortable with certain choices when I could actually ask Tomasz, I changed this, what do you think? Mm-hmm. There are a couple of instances where I really took a lot out of the poems, only a few, because I wanted every poem to be in Colonies. I know the French translation, a couple of the poems didn't appear because they're those kinds of poems where people say, oh, they're untranslatable. And how I chose to do it was that sometimes when long Polish names would get me in trouble in terms of my syllable count, I would take out the names and put them in the notes in the back. Mainly, I'm thinking of one poem in particular, a poem to Mickiewicz, where we have names like Putka Marowa, where, Putka Marowa, I've got 5 syllables in the name and I've only got 10 syllables for the line. So, I'd say my working relationship with Tomasz is very close. And we sat down numerous times over the translation of Colonies and hashed out various things.
Mm-hmm. And how have the Colonies been received so far in the US?
I've been thrilled by the reception, partly because as a translator, it makes me feel like, okay, I've done justice to this poet whose work I love, in that it received quite a lot of attention. Moderately in reviews, but more so on the prize, in the prize season. And I think that that's for a couple of different reasons. One, it's not a first book of his work in translation, so he's already known to some degree. But also because in the US, there's a lot of interest in poetic projects. In other words, books that the whole collection is unified around a set of questions or formal constraints. And Colonies really does that. It very much is that kind of poetic project. It's the way that Tomasz tends to work for his collections. And also, I think the way that it plays with or pushes up against tradition, pushes up against formal constraints, is very exciting and fun. Lastly, I think that some of its themes are resonant in American culture right now. For me, I love the theme that comes through of childhood and the loss of childhood, how that is a kind of colonization of self, of identity, of the body in various ways. But also the way it plays around with ideas of colonization, I think is very relevant for various discourses around our post-colonial experience.
Mm-hmm, I see. Okay, thank you, Mira, so much for your time in this very interesting conversation. And we really regret that you can't be here with us in person, but let's hope that this is not the last occasion to speak about Tomasz Różycki and Colonies in Oxford.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting Tomasz to read for you, and to Antonia for participating. You're in for a great treat.